Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to One Talk Seminar. It's a really great pleasure to welcome Professor Timothy Williamson from Oxford for the second talk. And today, the subject of today is a bit different than yesterday's. It's on the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori. And whether it's superficial or not. Thank you, Tim.
Right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, although it at least has the advantage that you don't have to hear me muffled by a mask. So this is a topic that I've written on before, and the talk I'm going to give you is based on my a draft of a contribution that I'm doing to yet another round between Paul Bogossi and me on the a priori, which will come out eventually in a new edition of Contemporary Debates in Epistemology. But I hope it's adding something to what I've said on these matters before. So using my eyes, I can see that there is a computer screen before me. With my eyes shut, I can see that the conclusion of a syllogism follows from the premises. The first C has a specifically visual sense, the second an intellectual sense, but the dead visual metaphor indicates some similarity between the two cases. At the very least, in one, I come to know that there is a computer screen before me. In the other, I come to know that the conclusion follows from the premise in the same unspecific sense of know. However, many philosophers claim a deep difference between the two cases, whereas my knowledge that there is a computer screen before me is a posteriori, my knowledge that the conclusion follows from the premises is a priori. On the standard philosophical use of a priori and a posteriori, those classifications may well be correct. Sorry, I'm pronouncing a priori and a posteriori in a very English way, but I guess it's clear what I mean. Yeah, so those classifications may well be correct, but that does not mean that the difference goes deep. A toy analogy. We correctly classify some bicycles as red. Sorry, so we're getting some interference, but yeah. We correctly classify some bicycles as red and others as not red, but that does not mean that there is a deep difference between red bicycles and non-red bicycles. More seriously, an attempt to define races by artificial DNA-based criteria might somehow succeed in partitioning all humans into a few mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive classes, yet reveal nothing of deep theoretical significance. The traditional one-liner about the difference between the a priori and the a posteriori is that a priori knowledge is independent of experience, a posteriori knowledge depends on experience. Of course, in the usual sense of experience, both seeing that there is a computer screen before me and seeing that the conclusion follows from the premises are, in their own small way, experiences. Without them, I would not have known those truths, or at least would not have come to know them in the way I actually did. Thus, friends of the a priori a posteriori distinction, which henceforth I'll just call the distinction, must do theoretical work to clarify what they mean by experience and depend, or else explain the distinction in other terms to make it deliver the outcomes they want. I will not discuss such attempts in detail here. Instead, I will focus on a standard paradigm of a priori knowledge and show how similar it is epistemologically to some paradigms of a posteriori knowledge. Although one can still draw a theoretical line between the two classes, it fails to mark a boundary of much epistemological significance. And so really the core of this paper is just about the example I'm going to be discussing. So a central sort of a priori knowledge is knowledge based on logical or mathematical proof. Unless such knowledge normally counts as a priori, the category of a priori knowledge risks being too sparsely inhabited, too marginal to matter much. The distinction's true friends should be willing to maintain that proof-based knowledge is normally a priori. Here is an example. Late one night, a mathematician has an idea for a proof of a new theorem. She hurriedly writes it down. The argument is long and complex. She's unsure whether it is correct. She does not yet know the truth of the theorem. The putative proof needs to be checked. Having written it down, she is exhausted and decides to leave the work of checking it until she is fresh after a night's sleep. The next morning, she painstakingly goes through the proof, checking each step, and verifies that it is correct by normal mathematical standards. She now knows the truth of her theorem. This is an ordinary instance of knowledge based on mathematical proof. As just explained, friends of the distinction should count her knowledge as a priori. So what does a mathematician do when she checks the proof? For instance, she looks at a passage written in her notebook and verifies that it constitutes a genuine instance of modus ponens. By ordinary mathematical standards, she's being very careful indeed. I mean, as it were, mathematicians don't usually, as it were, consciously note this is a case of modus ponens, but as it were, they just do it. But let's try to make this as elementary a case as we can. An instance of modus ponens where she makes a transition of the form from premises if A, then C, and A, to a conclusion C. She can verify that it's an instance of modus ponens because she can recognize an instance of modus ponens when she sees one, when it's in her own language. She would not recognize an instance in an unfamiliar language with a word she did not understand instead of if. With that proviso, her ability to recognize an instance of modus ponens when she sees one is a perceptual recognitional capacity. It involves a form of pattern recognition, like a chess grandmaster's recognition of an abstract pattern in the layout of the pieces on a board. Probably she can also recognize an instance of modus ponens when she hears one, though that is not quite the same skill. It depends on oral memory, especially when intervening material separates the premises and conclusion. And the great chess grandmaster may be unable to recognize the pattern of pieces by touch, for example. You know, a black pawn and a white pawn feel the same. That'd be one reason why they couldn't recognize it. Naturally, a visual recognitional capacity for modus ponens is selective in the sense that it treats many aspects of what is seen as irrelevant. But the same holds of visual recognitional capacities for shapes and colors too. The mathematician's visual recognitional capacity enables her to see that an instance of modus ponens is written there, looking at the notebook. Naturally, her attention is less on where it is written than on whether it is a genuine instance of modus ponens. Thus, we might more relevantly describe her as seeing that this is an instance of modus ponens. But her knowledge that an instance of modus ponens is written there, and her knowledge that this is an instance of modus ponens derive from the same underlying visual recognitional capacity. In the latter knowledge, the demonstrative this is perceptual, as in this is an instance of modus ponens. its reference is fixed by her visual attention, just as the reference of the perceptual demonstrative here or there in the former knowledge is fixed by her visual attention to a place on the page. Such recognitional capacities are likely to have been learnt and calibrated in sense perception, perhaps by trial and error through experience, one might say, and so owe much of their reliability to sense perception, however they are subsequently applied. For logically important patterns, such as modus ponens, the learning may have been fused with language learning of logically important words such as if. Although, actually, it's kind of hard to notice children being trained on modus ponens or anything, but never mind. Uncontroversially, the mathematician cannot know a priori that an instance of modus ponens is written there. She must know it a posteriori. Nevertheless, might her knowledge that this is an instance of modus ponens somehow count as a priori, even though the reference of the demonstrative is fixed by her visual attention? Well, perhaps, but that would support my claim that paradigms of a posteriori knowledge are very similar to cases of a priori knowledge. So it's not exactly helping the friends of the distinction to say that that one of those is a posteriori and one is a priori. Now, friends of the distinction may now complain that the emphasis on the written form of the proof is a red herring, is irrelevant, because in principle, the mathematician could verify the whole proof in her head. So is that a good response? Well, the first point is that the qualifier in principle is a euphemism for a huge idealization. Many proofs in mathematics are far too long and complex for anyone to hold in their head as a whole. Even if each individual step can be entertained in the head, verifying a proof also involves checking that the individual steps all fit together properly into a proof of the required conclusion. It is unclear how one could do that without some lasting record of the proof's individual components, such as writing makes available. For long proofs, human memory is insufficiently reliable. Of course, we can schematically imagine superhumans whose consciousness is vastly more capacious than our own, enabling them to take in and verify the proof in a single act of consciousness. But if our own knowledge of the theorem depends on sense perception, so does any knowledge we may have that a superhuman could know the theorem independently of sense perception. Another consideration is that mathematics is a collective enterprise. Proofs must be checkable by the community of mathematicians, just as experiments in natural science must be repeatable. One obvious mechanism for that is the refereeing process for articles to be published in mathematical journals. A mathematician's solemn promise that he has a clear proof in his head is not enough. A publicly available proof checked by other mathematicians or a computerized proof assistant is the epistemological gold standard. In those respects, surveyability and public checkability, a written proof is better than one in the head. In other respects, a proof in the head is quite similar to a proof on paper. Visualizing an instance of modus ponens is the offline version of the online process of seeing the instance. They differ primarily in the source of the inputs. One uses a visual recognitional capacity online to recognize instances of modus ponens in what one sees. One can reuse the same recognitional capacity offline to recognize instances of modus ponens in what one imagines. Similarly, expert chess players may use the same capacity for pattern recognition when they imagine a configuration on the board as when they see it on the board. Of course, in mentally rehearsing a proof, one is not confined to imagining formulas as for modus ponens. One may also imagine diagrams, pictures, but an imagined diagram plays much the same role as one seen on a board, though many of us find the one drawn on the board clearer and more stable. I'm much happier with working with a diagram that's actually written down than with one I'm just holding in my head. The same underlying visual recognitional capacities are in play online or offline, and there's some psychological support for that. Okay. The main advantages of doing mathematics in one's head when one can are just that it is comparatively quick and convenient. In short, to switch from going through a proof on paper to going through it in one's head does not avoid reliance on sensory perceptual skills. It is just a switch from relying on them online to relying on them offline. If that switch made the difference between a posteriori and a priori knowledge, the difference would be rather superficial and mainly to the advantage of the a posteriori side. Now, friends of the distinction may try a different line, objecting that such arguments go wrong because they focus on the perceived forms of representations instead of the contents which they represent. So a proof's written form merely enables access to the real proof, this would be the claim, a more abstract intellectual structure. Now, the trouble with that objection is that it neglects what formal proofs are for. A generally accepted requirement for a proof system to count as formal is that there should, in principle, be a mechanical procedure for determining of any given proof candidate, as some kind of sequence or array of representations, whether it constitutes a correct proof in the system. Any such procedure can be implemented on a computer given an appropriate way of scanning and coding proof candidates, for example, some kind of Gödel numbering. Although it may be controversial whether the system's basic axioms and rules of inference are sound on their intended interpretation, there should in principle be no additional controversy about the correctness of individual proofs in the system. Such a mechanical decision procedure for proofhood has to operate on formal aspects of proofs, not on their content. It's a kind of conception of formal proof that, for example, Leibniz adumbrated, but which was really developed in detail in the 19th century. For example, suppose that the computer has to determine whether X, Y, and Z, these are formulas, constitute an instance of modus ponens, with X the major premise, Y the minor premise, and Z the conclusion. In effect, it must determine whether X is the conditional with antecedent Y and consequent Z. For a language whose formulas are sequences of symbols from a finite alphabet with a conditional formulas written left to right, left parenthesis, antecedent, conditional symbol, arrow, let's say, consequent right parenthesis, the question boils down to whether X is the same formula as parenthesis, Y, arrows, Z, parenthesis. That question is easy to answer for a computer attached to a suitable scanning device with recognitional capacities for each symbol of the alphabet. By contrast, if the premises and conclusions of arguments were pure abstract contents with no such quasi-syntactic structure, it is quite unclear what could be meant by a mechanical test for being an instance of modus ponens. Thus, treating perceptible form as epistemologically irrelevant risks throwing away the very feature on which the epistemic value of formal proof depends. More generally, when one looks at a standard presentation of the rules, for example, in a system of natural deduction for a logic, one sees the introduction and elimination rules for the various connectives displayed as abstract visual patterns with modus ponens here being the elimination rule for the conditional. Learning the rules partly consists in acquiring visual recognitional capacities for those patterns, which one can use both online in perception and offline in imagination. Such natural deduction rules are sound and complete for first order logic and approximate well to the background logic of most ordinary mathematical reasoning. Of course, most proofs in working mathematics are not purely formal. Constructing and understanding them still requires pattern recognition, but the patterns are typically, as it were, macroscopic and specific to the relevant subfield. I mean, one kind of extreme example of that is, we can talk about this example if you're interested later, is appeals to Church's thesis in recursive function theory, which is a very high level kind of pattern recognition. Rather than microscopic and general, such as modus ponens. I mean, you know, working mathematicians, you know, they don't, as it were, have to go down consciously to the level of steps as small as modus ponens in order to check a proof. It's at a higher level, but it's still very much a matter of pattern recognition. Numerous shortcuts save time and space and prevent clogging detail from obscuring the key ideas. Such proofs are written to be understood and checked by experts in the subfield and are too informal to be checked by a computer. They may never get fully formalized. But we have no reason to expect such macroscopic pattern recognition to depend any less on forms of representation than does microscopic pattern recognition. It just depends on forms of representation perspicuous for macroscopic patterns, ones which make the macroscopic patterns salient. Moreover, when doubts about a proof intensify, it may require scrutiny at more and more microscopic levels. I mean, you know, when serious mathematicians or logicians are checking a proof, they don't actually go through it sort of mechanically step by step. They're actually scanning it to get a feel of the macroscopic patterns and looking for places where they don't feel completely, as it were, fluent with what's supposed to be going on, you know, getting a sense of where the problems might lie. And then they focus more, when there are sort of potential problem areas, they focus more and more intensely on those and get down to, as it were, more and more microscopic examination of what's going on in, you know, this potential problem area. So, you know, it's a lot more sophisticated than just mechanically going through it line by line, but it's still a matter of pattern recognition. Now, in fact, mathematics faces a growing problem with proofs so long and intricate that even leading experts in the subfield cannot be confident whether the proofs are correct just on the basis of checking them, as it were, by hand, let alone by brain. In response, there is a growing trend towards computer-assisted proofs, where human mathematicians interact with computer-assistant programs. The human enters raw definitions and subproofs. The program gives prompts whenever it finds a definition unclear or a step unobvious. The human provides clarifications or intermediate steps and so on. And so, you know, it could be quite a long interactive process. After several months of such work, a very difficult proof sketch by the field's medalist mathematician, Peter Scholze, of an important new theorem was recently verified earlier this year. Thus, formal standards of proof continue to play a key epistemological role in contemporary mathematics. Naturally, mathematicians hope to simplify and streamline complex proofs to make them more humanly intelligible. But it is an open question how far such hopes can be realized. I mean, some of these proofs that we're talking about go on for hundreds of pages. And, you know, and with those very long proofs, I've heard sort of specialists in the field saying that just to understand one page of the proof would take them weeks. In any case, if one treats the overt form of mathematical representations as epistemologically irrelevant, it is hard to explain the role of formal proof as a standard to which ordinary mathematical proofs are in principle held. How is a computer supposed to check a proof consisting of pure contents with no quasi-syntactic form? The illusion that overt syntactic form is irrelevant to an underlying, as it were, quotes, pure proof may result from the arbitrariness of basic logical and mathematical symbols. For instance, what symbol one uses for the conditional matters little. Although the arrow actually seems rather perspicuous for the meaning of the conditional, most ordinary mathematical proofs use a natural language conditional. You know, they don't use all the full logical symbolism. For mathematical purposes, the English word if is neither better nor worse than the Italian word se. Let us extend the term language to whatever systems of representation, formal or natural language, mathematical notation, even diagrams, is used in a proof. Since mathematical proofs can so often be translated from one language into another without mathematical loss or gain, one might get the impression that the language is irrelevant to an underlying language-free proof. But that would be a fallacy. For although no particular language is needed for a given type of proof, it does not follow that such a proof can work with no language at all. Similarly, if a philosophical argument can be given in any natural language, I mean, a particular philosophical argument can be given in any natural language, it does not follow that it can be given without the use of language. Some people claim to be able to give philosophical arguments by means of dance, but I mean, I don't think that most philosophical arguments could adequately be conveyed by dance alone. And anyway, dance would just be another form of representation, so it doesn't really make much difference. Thus, when we consider the epistemology of proof, we should not treat the language as something to be factored out. Its perceptible or imaginable presence is crucial, even though many different languages will do equally well. Without some language or other, we cannot even ask mathematical questions, let alone reason our way to an answer. One manifestation of the centrality of linguistic form to proof is in the role of free variables, which is ubiquitous in mathematics. I mean, you know, what people mean by an equation is normally something with some free variables in it. For example, where the letters X and Y are distinct variables, we cannot derive C, a conclusion C, from Fx and then if Fy arrows C, if Fy then C. By modus ponens, even though the variables do not differ in non-linguistic content. It might even be that there happens to be the relevant assignment happens to assign the same object, but for it to be modus ponens, the object assigned to the variable is in fact the same. It's got to be the same variable in order to do modus ponens. So in assessing this inference, an exhortation to attend to its content, not its form, would merely confuse the issue. I mean, you know, when we're dealing with something like a formula with free variables, and then you're just told, oh well, just think about the content of this, don't think about the form. It doesn't make much sense because, abstracting away the form and just going to the content seems like abstracting away which variable has been used. But once you've abstracted away from which variable has been used, then you can't tell whether you're dealing with a correct or incorrect version of modus ponens. The centrality of representational form is no mere artifact of proof checking. It is also central to proof construction. The idea for a proof often comes itself from recognizing a pattern in formulas, a diagram, or whatever, and the proof may be developed by manipulating such patterns and playing with them. Anyway, proof construction is not a separate process from proof checking. As the overall proof is constructed, the mathematician will be continually checking proofs of lemmas, larger or smaller steps towards the final destination. So you might wonder at this point, well, supposing we have some innate recognitional capacities, how are they going to play in here? Well, that some people might think that as it were, that there might be something distinctively a priori about these recognitional capacities if they're actually innate. So obviously no recognitional capacity for modus ponens for if is innate, since knowledge of English is not innate. I mean, we don't innately know what the word if means. According to Jerry Fodor, we have a language of thought, mentalese. There might even be an innate computational capacity to identify and accept instances of modus ponens for a conditional device in mentalese, which somehow underpins human understanding of natural language conditionals. I mean, I suspect that is not the right picture of what's going on, but you could maybe imagine that. But the proofs we construct and check in logic and mathematics are not in mentalese. They're in a formal language or a mixture of natural language and mathematical notation. Concern has been with those proofs and the knowledge we gain from them. We have seen how deeply that knowledge depends on the same recognitional capacities we use to gain ordinary sensory perceptual knowledge. So friends of the distinction, I mean, that's the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori, might still hope that perceptual recognitional capacities are needed only for complex proofs and can be bypassed for more elementary reasoning. But even that hope is vain. Consider again what an instance of modus ponens involves. Someone accepts, quotes, if A then C, and quotes A. For that to trigger her disposition to apply modus ponens, she must in effect recognize that the first thing she accepts is a conditional whose antecedent matches the second thing she accepts. That is a significant cognitive task, obviously when A, the antecedent, is long. I mean, because you've got to, as it were, see that it's actually the same thing twice over and not something slightly different, which is often actually quite difficult to do. But to some degree, even when it is short, she must also be able to extract the consequent of the first thing she accepts in order to make it the conclusion of her reasoning. Of course, she's unlikely to put it consciously to herself in such terms. Nevertheless, unless she has something like such capacities for recognition and manipulation, she will be unable to apply modus ponens. Thus, even very elementary reasoning involves perceptual recognitional capacities. So to emphasize, I have not argued that logical and mathematical proofs yield only a posteriori knowledge. I mean, it might have sounded as if I was arguing that, but I wasn't in fact arguing that. Because if some philosophers want to stipulate that knowledge based on logical or mathematical proof is simply paradigmatic of a priori knowledge, let them. Oh, that's okay, as far as I'm concerned. For all that, the knowledge was obtained through exercise of the same recognitional capacities through which we can also obtain paradigmatically a posteriori knowledge, such as, for example, the knowledge that there's, an instance of modus ponens on the page in front of us. So I just want to very briefly and totally schematically reflect on this from a sort of vaguely evolutionary point of view. We should not be surprised that paradigms of a priori knowledge involve ordinary perceptual recognitional capacities used in special ways online or offline. What else would one expect on evolutionary grounds? How much does knowledge of formal logic, mathematics, or philosophy increase one's chances of surviving to breed successfully and pass on one's genes? A special cognitive capacity dedicated to the a priori, for instance, a sui generis capacity to have intellectual seemings of necessary truth, that's a kind of dig at Paul de Gossian's view, would not pay its way in evolutionary terms. Extra brain power costs energy. So any extra cognitive faculty that we have or cognitive capacity, it's, you know, it's costly in from an evolutionary point of view, and it's got to repay that. A far more plausible explanation of the human capacity for a priori knowledge of formal logic, mathematics, and philosophy is that we do it by ingeniously applying our ordinary cognitive capacities for purposes they never evolved to serve, for instance, in the ways just sketched. Of course, such evolutionary considerations are not decisive. Not everything has an evolutionary function. There are spandrels, mere byproducts of something else which did serve an evolutionary function. Perhaps a special cognitive faculty dedicated to the a priori came along for the ride with the easiest evolutionary means to develop some fitness increasing feature. But a story on those lines starts at a disadvantage compared to an account like that above. When we can understand a feature of human cognition in an evolutionarily plausible way, we should be suspicious of any epistemological account of it in evolutionarily implausible terms. So clearly, many human cognitive achievements are to be explained culturally rather than biologically. Such explanations can still avoid evolutionary implausibility, for example, by showing how human communities found and developed new ways to use their basic cognitive capacities. Knowledge by proof is indeed a case in point. The traditional medium of proof in logic and mathematics is distinctively human, language aided by diagrams and symbols. Properly to keep track of complex proofs, writing is needed. Formal proof may go back no further than Euclid, though less formal proofs came earlier. Geometry itself originated with techniques for solving practical problems. If you can measure the sides of a field and thence calculate its area, you can estimate the crop yield. Until the 19th century, the intended subject matter of geometry was the structure of physical space. That was why the consistency of non-Euclidean geometries felt so threatening. Of course, as a branch of contemporary mathematics, geometry studies abstract structures whose relation to physical space it leaves to physics. But mathematicians still use what are in effect spatial metaphors as powerful means for understanding abstract structures. One sign of that is the role of diagrams in mathematical proof, highly valued by most mathematicians, which recruits their general abilities in spatial reasoning and manipulation for more abstract purposes. In doing so, they have learnt how to avoid reading more into spatial diagrams than they are meant to represent. The development of such mathematics by intelligent creatures with evolved capacities for spatial reasoning and manipulation is not utterly mysterious. One might say formal proofs in logic stand to informal verbal reasoning, as formal proofs in geometry stand to informal spatial reasoning, with similarities in their historical development. However, even logic has a spatial aspect introduced by the need for writing to keep control of complex proofs, as observed for modus ponens. So So there's, as it were, the spatial aspect, which just has to do with recognizing patterns and formulas, but in fact, there's also a spatial aspect. When you look at what's going on in more serious logic, for example, if you think of modal logic, then all the time people diagrams with dots and arrows to represent crypt key models and so on. So, and again, the spatial aspect of that is actually quite significant cognitively. So our ability to reason in our heads, as well as on sand, paper, or board, is part of a general human capacity to work offline in the imagination, as well as online, interacting with what we now sensorily perceive. Our cognitive capacities can typically be used both online and offline. Our capacity to work offline has significant practical value. In decision-making, we have to judge what will or may happen if we select a particular option. The natural way for us to determine that is by imagining selecting that option and realistically thinking through the consequences. Usually, such consequences are causal rather than logical, and by no means a priori. But by suitably filtering the background knowledge and belief we use in developing the initial supposition, we can in effect restrict ourselves to logical or mathematical consequences, as in a proof. This is a limiting case of our general capacity for reasoning under a supposition. These remarks are obviously just a beginning, but they suggest that there is no need to invoke a cognitive deus ex machina. To provide a special ingredient to cook up paradigms of a priori knowledge. The usual ingredients will suffice. Now, these challenges may tempt some simply to identify a priori knowledge with innate knowledge and a posteriori knowledge with acquired knowledge, given the scientific respectability of the innate acquired distinction. I mean, they might think, well, these other attempts to make the distinction are not getting anywhere, so let's just rely on this scientific distinction between innate and acquired. However, that distinction is itself contested on whether it can be defined scientifically, and if so, how. So actually the innate acquired distinction can be taken in various different ways. Even if we put those concerns aside, it is not clear that the innate acquired distinction will do what the distinction with a capital D, the a priori or a posteriori distinction is intended to do. For example, suppose that humans turn out to have an innate fear of snakes for good evolutionary reasons. And there's some evidence that that is in fact the case, that as humans, we do have an innate fear of snakes. So maybe we have innate knowledge that some snakes are dangerous, but do we really know a priori that some snakes are dangerous? Doesn't seem like it's going to be a terribly useful philosophical distinction if it turns out that that our knowledge that some snakes are dangerous is a priori. More generally, on such a view, the status of innate knowledge as knowledge depends on its evolutionary origins. In effect, it is a form of learning from the environment at the level of the species rather than the individual. Learning from the environment is not exactly the same as learning from experience, but what it was like for an early hominid with no fear of snakes to sit down next to one and be killed by it is not crucial to the evolutionary explanation, where it's not the actual qualia that you have when you're being killed by a snake that are important. Nevertheless, friends of the distinction may well feel that a species learning a truth by evolutionary interaction with the environment is closer to an individual learning a truth by perceptual interaction with the environment, and so to a posteriori knowledge than it is to a priori knowledge. Conversely, most mathematical knowledge is obviously not innate. Thus, the distinction's friends are likely to resist identifying a priori knowledge with innate knowledge and a posteriori knowledge with acquired knowledge. That just doesn't seem to be a helpful way to go as far as the epistemological distinction is concerned. So in the final section, I just want briefly to ask, well, if the distinction is shallow, then why should it seem deep? A cynical answer is that its apparent depth is an artifact of philosophical conservatism, The distinction draws prestige from its role in the epistemological tradition, going back to Kant and beyond. Those who hold it in respect naturally regard it as deep. But even if there is something to that cynical answer, it is not fully convincing. As a matter of common experience, sense perception is not part of every thought process. That is no mere quirk of human psychology. For computers too, internal computation is standardly distinguished from inputting and outputting. These elementary considerations may suggest that there must, in principle, be a radical distinction between knowledge dependent on sense perception and knowledge independent of it. Now, such a distinction may indeed be drawn if one focuses only on the final cognitive stage, culminating in the formation of the knowledge or belief at issue. But a taxonomy based only on the final stage would be blatantly superficial. For example, if one sees a black swan and thereby comes to know that not all swans are white, that knowledge would get classified as by thought rather than by perception, simply because the final stage is a deductive inference. No friend of the distinction wants that result. I mean, the result would be that it was a priori that not all swans are white. Thus, the taxonomy must take into account more distant epistemic progenitors too. That is straightforward enough when they're simply memories preserving relevant features of sense perception. But sense perception can also play a less overt role, sometimes by influencing which inferences one is disposed to make. For those who like the obscure term intuition, sense perception can influence which intuitions one is disposed to have. Analogously, input can modify the computer's program. In that case, there need be no input-independent outputs. Does this amount to some form of empiricism on which all knowledge and justification is a posteriori, perhaps on the lines sketched by Quine? I mean, again, it might sound as though that I'd been arguing something like that, but not at all. For empiricism characteristically minimizes the role of innate structure. If it cannot quite get away with positing an initial tabula rasa, it comes as close to that as it can, perhaps with an all-purpose Quinean similarity space for general inductive learning. By contrast, the present picture is consistent with richly differentiated innate structure, such as a Chomsky-style language module. In computer terms, even if input substantially modifies the program, the output may be highly sensitive to both the inputs and the initial program. Given such double sensitivity, the usual stereotype of the a posteriori is just as inept as the usual stereotype of the a priori. I mean, I think one thing that's often wrong with kind of Quinean arguments is that they proceed as though, we had a really clear account of what a posteriori knowledge is, and it's only the a priori knowledge that's obscure. But I think, in fact, as it were, the kind of stereotype of a posteriori knowledge is so unrevealing that we don't really have a good picture even of what a posteriori knowledge is, just from that crude contrast. So the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori, it works well enough in an elementary introduction to epistemology. I'm not saying it shouldn't be taught to first-year students, for a first pass survey of the material to be understood. But if we wish to go much deeper, the distinction becomes an impediment to understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Now we move on to discussion. Questions can be asked either from the room or from people attending online. If you are online and you want to ask a question, please just type question into the chat. If you are in the room, just raise your hand and keep it raised for a while.
Thank you for your talk. So just maybe 2 points that can be seen more as extending or suggesting direction, and I agree that these the posteriori and the priori, they are.
Yeah, I think it might be clearer if you spoke without. Sorry, but if you spoke without your mask, I think I.
Yes. So to the direction that I'm happy about the bringing in how a posteriori and empirical elements gets into the a priori, and I think also the other way around. So it's I think that one thing is that I think you might agree that without so at the same time that it's very fair to say that I mean we do still want to talk and not always in a shallow sense about a priori and a posteriori. This really in one way brings many areas of the things get into one another and related in all sorts of ways, play as aspects that as aspect 2 are related. And I would say that there is no that the idea of the a priori as general is just, I mean, it's never, you don't have completely right, and the more relevant, interesting aspect is you can call it the conceptual, which is already very important. So this is like a general. And then another thing, so your direction sort of it go in both in the a priori and in the posteriori, talking about or having some using some stereotype that exists but not alone of something both formal and mechanistic. And sometimes it goes like this, but actually when you think of it, both when you think of it more on the empirical, more on, and also more, it's also true on the priori, there are elements that are just not mechanistic and not formal. So not formal in ways that relate to patterns, but not by mechanistic following, but also. So for example, you started by looking, but I see that I look on the screen. So you can think that there are all sorts of patterns that capture in a more complex way what is a screen or looking in the perceptual way, looking in it, etc. But suppose that you see that one day and without reading in the paper about it or anything like this, you are just looking on the, even you're just in front of, like just walking in the street and on the air, you see some text getting written before it's actually, I take it from science fiction. So you will, after a minute, in addition to other things, you might think of it as like, it's a new kind of screen. So actually you get into extending your concept, but also understanding empirically and perceptually that the concept should be. So in this case, I'm just suggesting that in this case, the way that the empirical and the perceptual gets into the conceptual, the pressure is by content-related reshaping of a pattern, and not by just not at all biomechanical followings. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I properly caught everything that you said, but so I think one thing is that you kind of talking as though, as it were, we had this sort of with a model that in cognition we have some empirical elements and some conceptual elements, and then in real life cognition, then they tend to get mixed together, and so it may be difficult to have, as it were, a pure case of that's just all empirical or all conceptual, but still there, as where there are these two types of element which are being mixed together, and we could maybe call the empirical the a posteriori and the conceptual the a priori. I'm actually not accepting that. I don't think that when we look at individual cases of cognition, that what we find is something which is a mixture in that kind of way. We find these cognitive processes, like visual pattern recognition and so on. But I don't think there is any way of naturally dividing visual pattern recognition into empirical and conceptual elements. I mean, and in fact, unless conceptual. Well, I mean, I think it's actually the attempting to explain what empirical and conceptual meant there would be actually quite difficult. So I mean, so I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking what's going on, that as it were, that we're just dealing with mixtures of these two in principle quite independent things, and I think one can work that through with lots of examples. So you were also saying that, of course, that not all the cases of the a priori have the kind of, as it were, formal, mechanically checkable quality of the cases of mathematical proof that I'm talking about, and I totally accept that. So I don't think that the cases that are called a priori, that I don't think they are homogeneous. But I spent a lot of time on that particular case because it's such a, I mean, mathematical knowledge, which is generally based on, well, I mean, the kind of knowledge that mathematicians accept is based on proof. That's a very central case of a priori knowledge. And if it turns out that friends of the distinction have to start saying, oh, well, that's not really a priori knowledge, I think they're already they've conceded an enormous amount there, and they I mean, I think that if what should have been one of their best cases doesn't work, I think they're in trouble really across the board. And I mean, I think probably the defense won't work in any case, but certainly the distinction is going to be much less valuable if it can't include logical and mathematical knowledge. And but I think in with cases of putative a priori knowledge which don't seem to be of this kind of formal kind, then I mean we can give them separate treatment, which to some extent I have done in other work of mine, where the cases of the putative cases of the a priori I was considering were not ones which had that formal or mechanical quality. And so I think they're actually open to a not completely dissimilar argument. But I just wanted to take the case of mathematical proof separately and do it justice.
Thank you, Tim. Let's move on. Next question, Nate.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, excellent. So I wanted to see if I could save the distinction between a priori and a posteriori as significant. So I agree with you that in order to grasp a proof on paper, I certainly have to use some sort of perceptual pattern recognition capacity. However, one thing that I would say, let's say that I'm subject to some sort of illusion and what I think is written on paper is not actually what's there. It seems natural to say that in that case, either I'm grasping a distinct proof or what is much more likely, I'm grasping something that isn't a proof at all. But anyway, moving on to how to save the distinction, I think that in order to really grasp a proof, you have to be able to use relevant logical abilities correctly. And if I do use those logical abilities correctly, that guarantees that my belief in the conclusion is true. And this simply doesn't seem to hold in paradigm a posteriori cases. My mind could be functioning perfectly, but if I'm subject to some sort of perceptual illusion, then my resulting belief might be false. Yeah, so that was sort of the direction I wanted to take this. What do you think of that?
So on the aspect of illusion, I think one in principle have illusions in going through a proof in one's head as well. I mean, what one one could have the impression, even if you were just, if you were visualizing two formulas, you might have the impression that it might look as though one of them was the antecedent of the other, but in fact it wasn't. Or so I don't think that illusion is the key thing there. But I guess that wasn't really your main point. I mean, the main point was that, as it were, if you do deductive logic correctly, then you get something which can't be wrong. Whereas you can, as it were, not make a perceptual So there are a couple of points. I mean, one is it does to some extent make a difference how you individuate the capacities, and so if you individuate the capacities in a more externalist way, you may get the same effect in. I mean, as e.g. a capacity for acquiring, perceptual knowledge or something like that. I mean, that you may get the same effect that, as it were, if you haven't messed up in applying these capacities, then what you get will be true. I mean, there's a kind of implicit appeal to necessity of some kind, in a story of that sort, and so of course, it may also be, well, it may be get into trouble with examples of the necessary a posteriori, where if you know, as it were, if you classify, you know, animals according to their species correctly, I mean, maybe the, you know, let's say the connections between species and genera are and so on are all necessary ones. It might be that you will always get necessary conclusion. So I think, you know, I mean, there are certainly distinctions that one can explore there, but it's, I don't think it's going to pan out in a way that really corresponds to the a priori, a posteriori distinction. I mean, you know, another kind of example would be that, you know, it seems quite plausible that, you know, we can get some kinds of a priori knowledge by abductive reasoning, and you know, that certain kinds of hypotheses, you know, we can exclude on a, you know, because they're, you know, kind of crazily ad hoc or whatever. And, you know, for example, even in philosophical thinking, and so you know, we might have, you know, a piece of, let's say, philosophical reasoning that you know, friends of the a priori, a posteriori distinction would want to classify as a priori, but which used made some kind of abductive move of a, you know, of a very convincing kind, but there it would not be the case that, you know, if you do if abduction correctly, it's all, you know, you will never be taken from premises to from true premises to a false conclusion. I mean, abduction, as it were, you know, even the best sort of user of abduction can sometimes be using it and be led astray. You know, if we're, you know, if we're individuating abduction in a kind of suitably, you know, in a sort of more internalist sense. So I don't, I mean, you know, I mean, kind of interesting to explore what we get by those sorts of criteria, but I don't think they're going to correspond to, you know, the epistemological a priori, a posteriori distinction as traditionally understood.
Cool, thanks.
Next question is Zemersti. Can I ask you to answer? You don't ask first, then. Okay. Yes, just
yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks. I think I wanted to ask you maybe to say a bit more about who you're. Maybe this is just ignorance on my part about the literature. I don't know, because I was thinking of a sort of a friend of the distinction might say something like, well, you know, I'll grant you that proof checking involves pattern recognition and the exercise of perceptual capacities and all that. But it's still the case that, say, if I have a proof of, I don't know, 2 + 2 = 4, I won't set out to count, you know, apples and oranges to be sure that, you know, 2 + 2 = 4. And if I do that, and if I get, you know, 5 apples out of 2 + 2 apples, I'll think I'll make it. I'll think I made a mistake.
Yes.
Rather, yeah. Okay. So yeah. And again, the friend of the distinction might say, well, that's enough for me. So to go back, just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about maybe the context of how this particular discussion arises, or maybe something more about who your opponent is, or something. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, of course, my opponents are people, you know, who make a big deal of the a priori, a posteriori distinction. You know, I mean, what one of them, of course, was has been Paul Boghossian, with whom I wrote this book which came out last year. But I mean, you know, I mean, there are, you know, it's a pretty standard distinction in the epistemology literature. So the thing is, it's, you know, I mean, it's obviously, you know, correct that that if you just, you know, count out 2 apples and 2 oranges and then count, you know, the pieces, and you know, there's no other fruit, and then you count the number of pieces of fruit in this bowl, that you know, if you get some number other than 4, that does not show that 2 + 2 is not equal to 4. You know, e.g. because somebody's eaten one of the apples or has slipped a new apple in, or whatever it happens to be, in between the counting of the individual types and the counting of all the fruit. So I mean, nobody's suggesting that you know, that as it were, arithmetical truths are just kind of low-level empirical generalizations or something like that. In fact, I certainly think that that 2 + 2 equals 4 is a necessary truth. I think something that is reasonably well accepted in the literature is that you can't, that in classifying something as a priori, we're not saying something about what forms of disconfirmation are in principle relevant to it, or something like that. So you know, in the case of mathematics, there could in principle be empirical evidence against something, you know, that was a priori, or at least was advanced as a priori. So, you know, I mean, if we've got some, I mean, you know, at a very crude level, if we've got some kind of computer working on checking proofs, then, you know, I'm supposing when we feed in a proof, then it flashes a red light if something is wrong. I mean, then, you know, it could be that that when we feed in a certain proof, the computer flashes a red light, and then the mere fact that it's flashing a red light is itself reason for doubting some mathematical theorem, and you know, and that's, you know, and if this proof checker is reliable enough, it could be, you know, a decisive reason for doubting the theorem, you know, and even if the theorem is in fact correct, it might be that, you know, that in some sense we cease to justify it in asserting that it's true or whatever once the red light has flashed. And so this is a case where we don't know that we don't know what anything about what the proof checker has found. But it could also be that so that in that case we've got evidence which is sort of related to the details of the proof, but it could also be that that we find out that a particular mathematician was a fraud, and that all the proofs that he published from a certain year on, all the ones we've checked, all have big holes in them once you look really carefully. The referees of the journals weren't doing their job, and and it could be that we discovered that he actually had a plan to make trouble for the mathematical community, and then the mere fact that a certain proof was by this mathematician was published after a certain year, that might be good evidence that the proof is incorrect. And it may be even, it could even be part of this that not just that the proof is incorrect, but the result itself is false, because that was part of his evil plan. So, the fact that that we've got these, as it were, highly a posteriori ways, forms of disconfirmation doesn't automatically mean that we didn't have a priori knowledge to begin with. And I think that's something that probably most defenders of the distinction would now accept.
Thank you. Celia?
Hi, Tim. Thanks a lot for the talk. Well, I am a friend of the a priori, so I'm going to give it a go. But a very short go, actually, at that, because no doubt that visual pattern recognition plays an important role in long proofs, especially in long proofs. On the other hand, whether that role is an enabling role, a merely enabling role, or something deeper, is not clear at all to me. And the reason why is that it seems to me when you're looking at the proof and going through the pattern recognition, this is just a speedy way of doing the process of going through the proof. But without the proper understanding that that particular pattern is valid, you don't really have an understanding of the. Imagine someone that actually was trying to detect that as a pattern, a certain pattern, without no understanding of why it is valid, that specific pattern. So the person can go through the proof. This is a person.
Sorry, I'm losing you. You'll need to.
Well, at least it doesn't know it in a way that's why it represents a valid form of argument, yes. Understands it or knows it. So there is some sort of difference that has to be captured, and maybe difference of the deep of understanding that one has in one case and the other, that actually is at the bottom of the distinction between a priori and posteriori knowledge. No doubt that if I just go through the proof and just use my visual faculties, then my knowledge will be empirical. But do I understand it? Do I really understand it? So I don't know. That's my take for now.
So of course, the pattern recognition, we have to have a sense of, as it were, what this pattern is, and that's true with all pattern recognition. I mean, so that there's a difference between it's one thing for me to recognize your face and another thing to recognize that you're Celia. But the thing is, if the mathematician is thinking, I mean, they've got to have some sense that modus ponens is a valid form of argument, but as it were, the cognitive work is done. I mean, the main part of the cognitive work is just the pattern recognition itself, and then there's a kind of an extra. There is an extra bit which I agree is needed, which is that you recognize that this is a a valid proof. And and I don't, this is a valid form of argument that you're recognizing. But the fact that that's involved isn't enough to transform the knowledge that you're getting from this into a priori knowledge. So for example, when you look at the page, of the mathematician's notebook, and you do your pattern recognition, and then you could make the judgment. This is an instance of a valid argument form. This on the page here in front of me, there's an instance of a valid argument form. I mean, that's still a posteriori knowledge, even though the idea of validity has been worked into it. I think that you can't really, as it were, peel off a kind of an a priori bit, using this notion of validity, because So I guess that you could try to say, oh well, somehow we have a priori knowledge that modus ponens is a valid form of argument or something like that. But well, one thing is that, as it were, if you couldn't, if that was all you had, it wouldn't enable you to check these proofs, and I mean, you wouldn't make your knowledge of that you got from the proof a priori, because you would still need the pattern recognition to pick up that these were instances of modus ponens. So it wouldn't really do the work. But it also seems, if you try to sort of separate the knowledge that modus ponens is valid from the actual recognition of modus ponens, it seems more like some kind of blind dogma that modus ponens is valid. It's only, as it were, in the presence of a recognized instance of modus ponens, or at least schematic instance, that you can do this recognition of validity. So I don't really see that there is, as it were, some separable component of the cognition that it can be the a priori part. Although I certainly agree that for a recognitional, it's a recognitional capacity is a recognitional capacity for a certain individual or property or whatever it is, and that so there needs to be some connection with the validity for all of this to make sense. So I'm not disputing that needs to be part of the total story, but I don't think that's enough to enable you to separate out something that is a priori and doesn't depend on the pattern. That doesn't depend on the pattern recognition.
Bogdan has a follow-up on this point.
Yeah, it's a thing, as already I'm jumping the queue, with respect to Celia. I'm a little worried about this idea that there's really no leftover that can be, distinguished, clearly identifiable as a priori, particularly in terms of patterns, because now, I'm thinking of proofs, logical proofs that distinctively use patterns, like, proofs of cut elimination or normalization in natural deduction systems. Now, it seems to me that I could train somebody to perform all the pattern manipulations that are required, for instance, for cut elimination proof in classical logic, in LK, for instance. And yet, unless I've explained to them in sort of plain meta-logic English what cut is and what a proof is and what the point of a proof, of a logical proof is, it seems to me that just by teaching them to manipulate those patterns, they still haven't figured out what, you know, what's going on there. So they haven't understood, as Celia put it, they haven't acquired knowledge of, you know, how to prove things in a cut-free way, for instance, but they are perfectly capable of doing all the pattern
Yes, but I mean, that's the part that I was actually conceding to, well, conceding, I mean, I'm happy to agree with Celia about that, that it's, as it were, the story about the pattern recognition, it's got to be, you know, a pattern recognition of a certain type, and then the most general type. I mean, the general type here is valid form of inference, and and if you, as it were, if it's just that there's a matter of, oh, it's that pattern again, but without any sense of what this pattern is or what its significance is, then I agree that that is not the full understanding which we'd expect of a mathematician in checking a proof. But I don't think that that's, as you were, adding some further and different element which is somehow a priori in some purer sense. It's just that you acquire this capacity for recognizing valid proofs of certain forms, and so it's just as when you have if you have a capacity for recognizing dogs, it's not just that there's a certain pattern that you recognize, but that by picking up on that pattern, you recognize this is a dog, and that is an integral part of the recognitional capacity, and I completely agree that that in the case of it's a recognitional capacity for a type of valid argument step, inferential step, and in the same way that the chess grandmaster may have a recognitional capacity for a certain type of winning position on the board. It's not just, oh, it's that position again, but it's that's a winning position from my side or whatever. But so all of that seems to me clearly correct, but that is simply part of the fully fledged recognitional capacity. That a recognitional capacity is a capacity to recognize instances of something, or to recognize a type when you do it again, and that includes activating the knowledge that this is that thing, or this is an instance of that type. But that is still simply part of the pattern recognition, that we have the specification of the recognitional capacity has to include a specification of what it's a recognitional capacity for, and in this case what it's a recognitional capacity for is a certain type of valid argument, and so that it's for a certain type of valid argument is crucial to the recognitional capacity, but it's still a recognitional capacity that is originally applied in sense perception.
Next question, Elia.
Yeah, I want to ask something that relates to the first observation that Nate made, to see what the thing is, kind of trying to find a significant difference between the intuitively a priori case of saying that that step is an application of modus ponens. In the intuitively a posteriori case is the same. That step on that piece of paper is an application of modus ponens. So if we suppose that one is actually undergoing an hallucination of a piece of paper with a written application on it of modus ponens, that doesn't seem to prevent knowledge in the first case, intuitively a priori one, when one is still judging that is an application of modus ponens. Well, that is what one calls the third extension. If you, by focusing on the token, you mean actually to refer to the type the token is a token of. But that doesn't, even if that is an hallucination of there being a piece of paper, that doesn't prevent one's knowledge that the type is an application of modus ponens. In fact, it seems pretty much irrelevant to the epistemic status of the belief that that is an application of modus ponens. Whereas when we move to the intuitively a posteriori case, if we suppose that one is undergoing an hallucination of there being a piece of paper, then of course that does, we might even suppose that there is a piece of paper just nearby, just that one is not detecting it with one's perception. One's perception is an hallucination. But the fact that it's an hallucination seems to prevent one from knowing that application, that step on a piece of paper is an application for modus ponens. So what you say about the use of perception seems totally right, that perception is used a lot also in the case of intuitively a priori case. But it seems to be used in a way that seems very different from the way it's used in intuitively a posteriori case, for example, in this respect, that it's turning out to be an hallucination, doesn't tell against the epistemic status in the intuitively a priori case, whereas it does in the case of the intuitively a posteriori case. Isn't that a significant enough distinction in the role played by perception?
Well, yeah, I mean, on this specific case, so I was thinking of the this in, you know, this is an instance of modus ponens as a visual demonstrative, and it's not clear that a visual demonstrative, you know, will actually pick out some element of a hallucination if you're actually having a hallucination. I mean, if it's picking it out by, you know, by roughly speaking, it's by location. You know, if it's just a hallucination, you may not be picking out anything at all. So I think, you know, I mean, I think it's not, I mean, I don't think that it's super clear which way to go on that, but I don't think it's obvious that you know, that this in a case of hallucination will actually even secure reference. I mean, the other thing is that, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which, you know, hallucination might, you know, if you're lucky, it can give you things that you know, you can, as it were, use cognitively, but in some kind of unexpected way. So, you know, so if you hallucinate, you know, a certain type of hat, you know, you might think, you know, wow, that's a, you know, that type of hat is going to sell really well or something. And, you know, and maybe, you know, then you go and manufacture it. And and it could be that you know, you know, if you just happen to hallucinate somebody wearing, you know, that type of hat, you can also, you know, think, oh, well, that's, you know, that would be a, you know, a fantastic type of hat that would sell really well, and you know, and you might make your fortune from this hallucinated type of hat. But it doesn't mean that that, as it were, there was some sort of, as it were, nothing relevant went wrong with the original experience. It seems more like a, you know, a case, and it certainly wouldn't be that somehow, you know, that was going to put the hat case, you know, on the side of the a priori. It would just be that that sometimes, as it were, you know, when, you know, if you're, you know, when things are going wrong, they may be, you may be able to, as it were, rescue something from the ruins, which you can then and then use. But it doesn't mean that the, you know, that they were going okay in the first place. So that, you know, I think it's just that that in the, you know, with the case of hallucinating a proof, a hallucination might give you, you know, as it were, a substitute that was okay, that was good enough in the relevant respect. But it you know, it could do that, as I say, for matters of, you know, hat production as well as for mathematical proofs. So I'm not sure that there's really anything very systematic there.
Question is Anton.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Tim, thank you very much for the talk, and thanks to the organizers for realizing the event. So I have a question which is somehow a variety of, or a variation of some of the previous ones. I mean, everybody who seriously defends the a priori a posteriori distinction always makes the qualification that it's independent of experience for its justification. So I think Kant says, you know, all knowledge starts with experience, but not all knowledge is justified by experience. All right. So there's this distinction between enabling, so an enabling role of the experience and a justificatory one. And so going to the pattern in question back, I mean, I'm not sure whether I really understand what kind of pattern this should be. I mean, whether it's really a visual pattern. I mean, whether we write it from left to right, bottom to top, or top to bottom in a diagonal fashion. The symbols are not really essential. So I totally agree with you that no single aspect of the language seems to be essential, even though that there is some kind of language or representational device is very important, at least. And I would compare the situation with, for example, how big the symbols are. I mean, if the symbols with which I want to operate are so big that, you know, one of them goes from Vienna to Tokyo, I won't be able to work much with this kind of things. So everything which is relevant to the visual aspects of the so-called precognition, may it be spatial form or the texture or the colors or the contrast or whatever, seems to be not really important for the justificatory role. So I was thinking rather that what gets in a variety of ways, non-equivalent ways, encoded visually is really something enabling to grasp a rather intellectual structure, or abstract structure of the argument. So what do you think about this kind of line?
Well, yeah, so I mean, I wasn't actually, you know, I wasn't working with the enabling evidential distinction because I wasn't, you know, I didn't want, I mean, not that, I mean, simply because I wasn't assuming that defenders of the distinction had to characterize it in that way, but it's, you know, but I wasn't, but of course, I mean, they can characterize it in that way if they want. So the thing is that if you don't, I mean, what I'm partly arguing is that in a cognitive and justificatory way, as it were, apparently quite superficial features of the notation are actually extremely important, and so you know, so suppose, for example, that that you wrote a proof out using invisible ink, then that proof would be cognitively worthless, even though, you know, in a sense, you know, what you wrote was just the same, and you know, maybe if you were to heat up the page, then we would get something that would work cognitively. And you see, I think that when we talk about the intellectual structure, I don't think that really makes sense, except as some kind of very slightly abstracted version of the, you know, something more like the syntactic structure. You know, so that for example, you know, if you just, I mean, one way of really trying to abstract from it would be to think of propositions as something like just sets of possible worlds, because sets of possible worlds don't have anything like syntactic structure. But you know, if you're simply presented with an instance of modus ponens with you know, in terms of sets of possible worlds, there's no way of recognizing it as an instance of modus ponens. I mean, you could only recognize it as an instance of modus ponens if the propositions are represented in some way which enables you to tell that the as it were, that the second premise is the antecedent of the first, and that the conclusion is the consequent of the first. And you know, that's something that is just completely, basically rendered invisible, you know, if you have the coarse-grained propositions which don't, as it were, actually articulate this structure. And so, you know, if we're talking, so in order for this to be, you know, something where we can actually, you know, verify modus ponens, we need things which have pretty much this syntactic structure. I mean, as you say, of course, you know, there's more than one type of syntactic structure that will work, but you know, it's not, you know, it can be very sensitive. I mean, so that, for example, you know, Arthur Prior and you know, wanted to follow the Polish logicians and using Polish notation, and where basically you write the operation before the arguments rather than between the arguments if it's a two-place operation. And just the effect of writing proofs in Polish notation made them extremely hard to take in. And I mean, that was why Polish notation never really took off, in spite of Prior's advocacy and so on. I mean, it never took off in the English-speaking world, and didn't really take off in the end in Poland either. And you know, and so that's even, as it were, a much more trivial feature of the notation. You know, like that, it was actually extremely cognitively significant, and so, you know, that was what I was, you know, in effect arguing, that that although, you know, of course there are many different notations which are equally good, but that does not mean that the real proof is notation free, because if we try to go to something that's notation free, we'd actually lose the very aspects of articulated structure that enable cognition to take place in the first instance.
All right, thank you very much.
Next question, Federico.
I think that statement was also on mystification. So it was more or less.
So, Danielle?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the talk. So, okay, I'm not a friend of the a priori a posteriori distinction, and so I'm in agreement with. I expressed agreement with Tim's previous misgivings on the distinction, so I'll make two observations, which I don't know if they'll require an answer, to be honest. But anyway, one is this, that I was kind of constantly reminded during the talk of Bird's paper on content preservation. Bird's paper also talks about how in a proof we need some cognitive capacities that are like distinct from the pure ability to a pure logical ability. And well, in its cases, it concentrates on memory, of course, mostly. And he also notes that already in Descartes' rules on early work by Descartes, the exact title escapes me. Descartes notes that a long proof does not fit its paradigm of intuition, and because it relies on memory in part. And of course, Birch takes sort of the opposite route that you take, because he says that yes, memory has this role, but it's only enabling because it's only about content preservation. But then he has to take the same line on testimony, because there too it's only content preservation. And he ends up with the idea that if I know by testimony some mathematical truth, I know it a priori. And this is, I think, kind of grist for your meal in a way, because it shows that you have to go quite a long way to accommodate all these different cognitive capacities that enter into the production of, say, mathematical knowledge. And this was the first observation. The second, really quick, is this: you can react to this if one accepts your what you said here, and also in your previous works in this. You can sort of react in two ways. You can have an emphasis on the sort of let's call it holistic aspects of the conclusions that we reach, in that in each piece of knowledge, there is sort of, well, to paraphrase Quine, there are a priori and a posteriori components, but there is no pure a priori and no pure a posteriori. And in each piece of knowledge, they are compenetrated, so to speak. But also you can react in the opposite way, in a way, and say that the a priori a posteriori distinction is actually too coarse-grained. It doesn't serve a useful epistemological purpose, because partly in light of what we know by, from cognitive science, but also in light of, further philosophical reflections, we need much more fine-grained distinctions to, serve useful epistemological purposes. So I guess this is a question: which of the two ways do you find more congenial, so to speak?
Yeah.
Go forward.
Yeah. So in relation to Burge, I would be interesting to look at exactly how he words it, but the way Burge tends to talk, as I recall it, it's as if all these enabling things, basically what they enable us to do is to get from the, the kind of, as it were, the messing about with the symbols on the page and all that, and they enable us to sort of translate that into some. This is related to what Anton was saying, as it were, into some kind of pure realm of the intellect, where we're just engaging with the purely intellectual matters, and so what I'm in effect arguing is I just don't see that there is that final stage where we're still engaging in the relevant sort of cognitive activity, but where we're dealing with something which is, as it were, completely notation free or something like that, because I think that the kind of structure that we have to engage with in assessing a proof is a kind of structure that really only makes sense for something in some kind of notation or other, because roughly speaking, because it has to have something like some kind of quasi-syntactic structure. So I agree, of course, that with what you were suggesting, which is that Burge gets taken, to pretty extreme conclusions by his insisting on the second on his line. On your second question, I think I'm more sympathetic to the second of the options that you were suggesting, and I think it's partly that I don't think it's helpful to think of this as well, everything is a kind of mixture of experience and something non-experiential or something like that, because I don't think that there really are these well-defined sort of elements that we can then somehow then get mixed inextricably together. So I think what we need is something that well, you were saying more fine-grained. I mean, it may be that it's also that it's simply drawing lines in different places, but I think this is probably something where we're in the end we're going to have a lot to learn from cognitive psychology, although not that I think that cognitive psychology can do all the work of epistemology, but I think that epistemology is going to need to be better informed by it than it has been in the past, and that the kinds of distinction that we're going to make. I mean, some of them, some of these may be very, very broad categories that we take over from cognitive psychology, but they won't be the same categories as the ones that we've been using. And I think one reason for that is that so much of traditional epistemology has been concerned with what is happening at the level of consciousness, and that's particularly the case with the kind of internalist accounts of the a priori, a posteriori distinction that you get from, for example, people like Boghossian, and I think one thing we need to learn from cognitive psychology is that most of the interesting action is not at the level of consciousness, and in cognition, and that to think about these issues properly, we need to stop focusing so much on, as it were, the very, very narrow issue of what happens at the level of consciousness, and to take account of what the underlying cognitive processes are, because, as it were, by the time things get to the level of consciousness, very often most of the cognitive work has already been done.
Next is Elton. Thank you, Chair, for the talk.
I want to ask you if you think there is a role for a priori in genuine deduction.
Louder, please, louder.
Can you hear me?
Can you just say that again? I didn't really catch quite what you were saying.
The question is if you see some role for a priori and genuine deduction as in a scientific theory, for instance, or in Sherlock Holmes' history. I will give some examples of that. For instance, we can sometimes anticipate what will happen in the world in the context of scientific discovery, or even also the fact that we have clues outside the world that are less significant without a theory before or without genuine deduction, may suggest maybe that there is a room for some sort of a priori. And if you think there is no a priori at all in the context of a genuine deduction, how to explain the fact that those clues outside of in the world are less significant for us without a genuine deduction, you know?
Yeah. So I want to emphasize, I was not arguing that there's no such thing as the a priori, and in particular, I was not arguing that the deduction is not a priori. All that I was arguing is that it's actually much more similar to things that we would regard as a posteriori than we tend to think. And and so when I was talking about perceptual recognitional capacities, for modus ponens and so on, I'm perfectly okay with somebody saying that we put all this together, we get a deductive proof, and then we end up with a priori knowledge of the conclusion. I mean, if they want to classify it as a priori, that's okay by me. I'm not, I'm really not putting any restrictions on what ends up being counted as a priori. I'm just saying, if you actually look at what's going on in a fairly standard piece of acquisition of deductive knowledge, which the mathematician was getting by checking the proof. I mean, because I was assuming that she didn't already know it, but before she checked the proof, because it was only when she checked it that she acquired the knowledge in this case. That all sorts of perceptual processes and perceptual recognitional, pattern recognition and so on, are involved in that process. But if you want to say that the result is a priori, that's okay. I mean, because I don't mind too much, as it were, exactly where people want to draw the line between the a priori and the a posteriori. I just want to emphasize that what we're dealing with here is not some set of special cognitive skills which are sui generis and a priori, but with very specific applications of more general pattern recognitional perceptual skills that we have, which we have in the logical tradition. We've turned into this very powerful thing of formal deductive proof, which is great. But we've done that not because as it were, there's a little a priori module in our brain which just does pure a priori stuff. We've done it by actually making very sophisticated uses of our much more general cognitive capacities, which nobody thinks are in general a priori.
Thank you, Tim. It's already after 6. Would you be happy if we have still a couple of questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to, basically, I'm happy to go on answering questions as long as people have questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's take at least more 10 minutes. So next is Jakub. Jakub?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Well, I wrote my question down.
Can you read that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I wrote the question down in the chat, but I can read it out loud if you can hear my voice well.
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so S can know that X is an instance of modus ponens. For example, they can know that something is an instance of modus ponens a posteriori, only a posteriori, by, for example, seeing it on paper written out. And this is, I think, what you said. And this is knowledge how, or as they say, a practical skill that needs to be learned, and only some people with certain dispositions can learn it. But the friends with the distinction, of course, they can admit to this and still say that once the subject knows that something is an instance of modus ponens, well, then the subject knows a priori that X is valid. So that is an instance of a priori knowledge. But perhaps there is, after all, nothing else to the collection of symbols X being an instance of modus ponens, other than that it is recognized by certain subjects with certain skills as an instance of modus ponens. So there is sort of no there is no knowing that, in the sense that something is an instance of modus ponens. And this is something, I think you did not say this, but I think it was somewhat it could be sort of derived from what you said about the content of formal presentations. So you mentioned that formal presentations can be made medium independently, so with any symbols or in any language, but it does not follow that you could make the formal inferences, for example, modus ponens, without any medium. So you need some medium. But then the sort of natural thought that came to me, at least, is that, well, there is just nothing else than this medium, in a sense, and these pattern recognition abilities, at least in case of modus ponens, for example. So would you be opposed to this, or do you still think that there is, after all, some genuine instances in logic and mathematics of knowing that knowledge that is a priori?
So when I was discussing this example, I wasn't directly concerned with the question of whether we knew a posteriori or a priori. You know, I think there were certain cases when you actually looking at, you know, when you have the knowledge that, you know, there's an instance of modus ponens on that bit of paper, that you know, that I think is, you know, virtually everybody would say that's a posteriori. You know, that there is, but I was, you know, I was allowing that it could be a priori, that, you know, that you might have a priori knowledge that this is an instance of modus ponens, where this is somehow, you know, doesn't specifically require it to be on the piece of paper or whatever. But I was more concerned with what's going on in these cases. Now, I mean, I think there are a number of issues in what you're saying. So one is, of course, if it might be that we know how to recognize something as an instance of modus ponens. I mean, I'm not sure, it might just be whether this is a good case of knowing how. But of course, on my view, you know, given the account of knowing how that I've defended with Jason Stanley, if it's a case of knowing how, then it is a case of knowing that. So we wouldn't be, you know, if it turns out that knowing how is somehow involved here, that doesn't make it not propositional knowledge. And also, you know, the knowing how would be knowing how to recognize instances of modus ponens. but then the recognizing itself would would make the recognizing itself an instance of knowing how. I mean, it's just it might just be something that you do, and I mean, like somebody might know how to recognize whether a medieval manuscript, whether a putative medieval manuscript is a fake or not, but the knowledge, whether it's a fake would be propositional knowledge, and it seems to me pretty clear that it's just straightforward propositional knowledge that in a given case that something is or is not an instance of modus ponens. That there's just that it's clear what the proposition is. The proposition is that this is an instance of modus ponens. So I think we're definitely dealing with propositional knowledge here. I wouldn't myself go for the kind of response dependent account of what modus ponens is that you were suggesting, where what counted as an instance of modus ponens had to do with what the qualified judges would count, because I'm not convinced that response dependent accounts are actually correct of anything at all. But within the case of modus ponens, we've got a perfectly good definition of modus ponens, both specifically for a given notation, but also a more generic one, for an arbitrary notation, provided that we've got some kind of conditional operator in the language, and it just seems like in principle the kind of account of what competent judges would take to be an instance of modus ponens, that there might be instances of modus ponens, for example. Well, I mean, one sort of rather trivial case would be very, 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 very complex instances of modus ponens, which competent judges were just simply unable to judge because it was computationally beyond their means. So I think modus ponens itself has to be understood. If we're talking about it as a fixed notation, then there can be a purely syntactic definition of it. If we're talking about as well the general idea of modus ponens without specifying what the notation is, then we also have to bring in semantic ideas, because because we need the idea of a conditional operator, and that's a semantic idea. And in fact, I don't, there isn't going to, I mean, the idea of a competent judge, if we were talking about the general standard of modus, as with a notation independent conception of modus ponens, where it can apply to arbitrary notations. I mean, there isn't going to be perhaps even couldn't be a judge who's somehow competent with all possible notations. The most we can expect is somebody who's competent with some given small subset of notations.
Thank you, Bruno.
Hi. So this is still about the modus ponens point and pattern recognition there. And I do take the point that to begin with, I don't know how significant that is for the overall project, because I do agree that sometimes there is some pattern recognition with respect to just seeing a written sentence, seeing that written sentence embedded on something really conditional, and then just inferring the consequence of that. But it does seem to me, and it seems fairly, and I think it's a fairly general phenomenon, that sometimes we reason with what you might call modus ponens, and it is semantic in the way that you're describing it. So here's an instance. So X is infinite if X can be put into one-to-one correspondence with a subset of itself, then Y is infinite, therefore Y is infinite. So this looks to me as an instance of modus ponens, but it's certainly not an instance of the thing that you program the computer to recognize. What comes to my mind is that this talk of pattern recognition, sometimes it's true, sometimes mathematicians are expedient, they want to just get through because they know that these things preserve truth, even if they don't know what the content of what they're reading is. But as you were putting it, as you were saying, when they get to the details, when they want to see the details, they will consider more than just pattern recognition in respect to any properties of the spatial symbols. They want to know what's being said and what relations are between them. I mean, all this seems fairly trivial, and I'm not certain whether you're in a position to it or not. I was just unclear as to how much role this pattern recognition is playing in the overall dialectic.
Well, so the pattern recognition, was just that was just, as it were, a component of the kind of proof checking that gives you deductive knowledge, and then the role that it was playing was that once you look very carefully at what's going on with it, you see how very close it is to things that get, that are paradigms of a posteriori knowledge. Doesn't mean that it has to be counted as a posteriori itself, just that it's so similar to them. And actually, if you actually look at the way that mathematicians check proofs, I don't think it corresponds to what you were describing, because you were talking about it as, well, as it were, the first pass thing, they're just looking at the symbols, but then when they get down to to a really difficult bit, then they start thinking about the meaning. That I think it's almost the reverse of that. That they, the initial take is, where the kind of one I was describing as macroscopic is where they're thinking very much about just what the mathematical structures are, and so on, and so they're thinking not about any particular formulas, but just about the general mathematical issues, and and then when they get to something that looks as though it might be a trouble spot in the proof, then they start looking more and more carefully at the formulas themselves, so that, as it were, particularly because they may be dealing with a form of argument that is in fact valid, but doesn't fit any of their usual macroscopic patterns, because it's original, or maybe because, as is sometimes the case in mathematics and logic, you sometimes have very, mathematicians and logicians don't like this, but you sometimes have very complicated proofs which just don't conform to a nice pattern, and then there's really not much alternative but to roll up your sleeves and go through and check that everything is exactly as it ought to be, and so it's at that level where it's kind of harder to form a gestalt of what's going on, that then you have to resort to something that is closer and closer to just microscopic pattern recognition at the level of the individual symbols, and you're actually comparing two formulas to check that the left hand side really is the same all the way along, on each line, and that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Louisa?
Hi, thank you for the presentation, and thank you for organizing this meeting. I wanted to ask something about very abstract knowledge, namely, I grant that when we recognize modus ponens, we recognize it through pattern recognition of different instances of it. And probably we recognize validity through pattern recognition of different instances of it. But suppose that we want to recognize, we recognize that modus ponens is valid. So would you go through it saying that it is a kind of pattern recognition, even if when we are thinking about this abstract level, very abstract level, namely we are describing a type of reasoning and say that this type of reasoning has a certain type of a second order type of property like validity. I was thinking whether you are thinking about this kind of reasoning in terms of recognition.
I mean, so of course, you know, there's a very interesting issue about what is going on, you know, and this, which applies, you know, to things like soundness proofs and so on, because there is this aspect of you know, apparent circularity in them, because we seem to be using modus ponens, you know, invalidating modus ponens, but you know, we're using it in the object, sorry, the meta language, you know, to validate it in the object language. But you know, I think that and so there, that, you know, there's a question. Well, then, but then, how come we're using modus ponens, you know, in the meta language? And you know, I think you know, if we think about, well, you know, how do people get the idea that modus ponens is valid in the first place? Well, so I think what's going on is it isn't actually something as crude, you know, crudely inductive as, you know, well, we just notice a few truth preserving things, and then we you know, instances, and then we kind of realize, you know, that these all form a pattern. I mean, actually, my view of this is, it has an extra level of complexity, which comes out in my recent book on conditionals, because you know, I think what's going on is that that we have a much more general heuristic for assessing conditionals, which has to do with, you know, which is kind of a generalization of the Ramsey test for conditionals, and so that's something that we learn without, you know, I mean, nobody's kind of drilling us in the Ramsey test, but it is something. I mean, it seems to be as it were some kind of something that's probably a human universal in effect, that we're capable of this kind of suppositional thinking, which, you know, is hooked up to conditionals. I mean, the sort of kicker with the suppositional test that I think we're using is that actually the suppositional test, in my view, is just a heuristic, and it's not 100% reliable, because it's actually inconsistent, and it's just that, as it were, the modus ponens is one, you know, is something that we can derive from it, and is, as it were, is, if you like, is part of the completely healthy part of this test. But it's all, it's in a way, it's all sort of implicated with some other stuff which is also built into the test, and which is more dubious. And so, you know, so it's definitely not the case that this heuristic that we're using is something that we have a priori knowledge of, because we can't know it, because it's not even correct fully. It's just that as with, you know, it's the same kind of thing as we have with perceptual heuristics that they, you know, most of them give us wrong results in certain cases. I mean, that's how we get these visual illusions and so on, but that doesn't mean that we can't have perceptual knowledge in the good cases. And so I think that from this sort of, in its origins, you know, pretty much, as I say, humanly universal, innate kind of heuristic, we you know, a capacity to use to do modus ponens just in natural language in an unreflective way, and then I think you know, once we're checking formal proofs, we've kind of used, you know, those cognitive capacities, you know, in a more reflective way to see that that modus ponens is a valid you know, form of inference, and you know, and then we have, you know, as I said, we have the cognitive recognitional capacity for it. But I think that's, you know, that is, as it were, you know, that's something that's going on at this stage of you know, more reflective knowledge that we have in, you know, logic and mathematics as, you know, as scientific disciplines, and you know, so that, you know, because it's, you know, I think it's pretty clearly the case that when people are, well, at least there's no conscious perceptual recognition of instances of modus ponens just in, you know, in ordinary conversation or something like that, even if it's sometimes kind of there in the background. So I think sorry, that's a rather complicated answer. So, but I think the cognitive story behind, you know, people checking that something is an instance of modus ponens is itself extremely complicated, and involves, you know, quite a long, well, both quite a complex story about what's going on with the ordinary use of conditionals, and then also a rather complex story about how we get from the sort of unreflective use of conditionals in natural language to the way that we get to the reflective use of modus ponens as a formally valid form of inference when we're doing logic.
But when we reach this kind of reflective attitude, what are we doing? Are we still doing recognition of patterns, or are we reaching a higher level or a different level, in your opinion?
I mean, I don't think that we're ever getting beyond, you know, we're not kind of ascending to some level where we're as it were, we no longer need recognitional capacities or anything like that. I think what's going on is that that a lot of you know, cognitive processes which are, you know, in normal life are pretty much unconscious, you know, such as the use of modus ponens. I think that we're managing to find ways of making at least some cases of those. You know, we're articulating them and then doing them in a way which subjects them to conscious control, which is what we have with mathematical and logical proofs. And so that, you know, that then something that's that we can, you know, you know, we become more consciously reflective of them, and so these are more like conscious recognitional capacities. But you know, I think if you think about the, you know, the role of the meta language, you know, in for example, in soundness proofs. And I think, often people, they worry that if you're just shoving it up to the meta language, then that looks like, that we're just starting at infinite regress. But I think what's crucial is that the normal meta language in logic is not itself a purely formal language, but is a natural language, with some extra, notation added. And so we're actually, what we're doing in the meta language is we're using conditionals, typically a natural language conditional. We're using them sort of unreflectively, and without as it were, searching for modus ponens patterns or whatever. But something similar has to be going on at an unconscious level. But we're using the conditional in the unreflective way that we use it in ordinary life, and so we're just drawing on our capacity to use the relevant heuristics for conditionals, but then we're using those kind of unreflective cognitive skills to certify the validity of certain patterns in the object language, which we can then, as it were, consciously reason about. That, as it were, when we're actually doing the soundness proof, and of course mathematicians, they're typically not involved in soundness proofs like that, but as it were, they're kind of they're making the mathematical part of their reasoning conscious, consciously articulated and written down and so on, so that it can be checked and made public in this way. So we're it's a kind of complex process of rendering explicit stuff that normally we do implicit, and that we need to render it explicit to have the kind of intellectual control of it that the success of mathematical proof is based on.
Okay, thank you.
We'll stop here. Thank you for being so generous with your time, and also, of course, for the very challenging talk. Thank you.
Well, thanks for all the discussion.
As we hope to see you in Lisbon in flash.
Yes.
As things go to normal, go back to normal. We hope to see you.
Yes, I very much want to get back to Lisbon and see Lisbon again and see all my friends in Lisbon. And so yeah, I would love to do that. And I'm so sorry I couldn't manage it this time. But maybe it'd be more fun, in a year's time or something, when we don't have to wear face masks, I hope. Anyway, okay. Great to see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.